Okay. So we said it belongs on every door, on the city gates, on the right side, on the top third. It should be affixed. The bracha, when we make a bracha, what about multiple doorways? How do you hide it in the doorway? What's the minimum room size? How do you define the doorway? We spoke a bit about that last time. We said first put up the door, then the mezuzah. We spoke about other types of structures and how yesterday we ended off by saying it needs to be in an honorable place, which takes us to halacha 19. She says a house or a courtyard in which a Gentile also resides is exempt from the mitzvah of a mezuzah. Meaning the Torah says you should put it on on your doorpost. Your doorpost implies that it is only a requirement for the Jew. This is another mitzvah. There are some mitzvahs which are for all of mankind. This mitzvah is particularly for the Jewish people. And so if you have a partnership with a non-Jew, or you share a whatever it is, some form of dwelling, then it does not require mezuzah. So that would apply to a business. It would apply to a holiday home, timeshare, whatever it was. As long as you have joint ownership with a non-Jew, then it would not require mezuzah. Although when I speak about joint ownership, I really mean joint usage. Because if you have a non-Jew that owns a property and you rent from him, so as long as you're renting from him, it means you have sole occupation. So then you would require a mezuzah. Vice versa, if you owned a building and you were renting out a room, a space to a non-Jew, then there would be no mezuzah required because that area has sole occupation of a non-Jew. So that's quite relevant for businesses. Okay. You would be able to put up a mezuzah without a bracha, but a mezuzah is not required. Okay. If the space is being used by both of you. A cellar whose doorposts and doorways are flush with the ground is exempt from the mitzvah of mezuzah because it is not considered a doorpost unless it's standing. So you see this a lot in New York, where every store has an underground where they keep all their stuff. So you have these metal doors, like a trap door that opens up, and then they have this, either a staircase or often they have a conveyor belt, an electric conveyor belt, and they keep all of their merchandise underground, and then they go up and down. So it's a regular doorway. There's a door and it opens up and people go in and out. But since the doorway is not sitting upwards, but it's lying flat on the floor, so that does not constitute a doorway. The doorway needs to be standing up, vertical, not horizontal. Okay, that takes us to 21. If you rent a house outside of Israel, you are exempt from putting up a mezuzah for 30 days because it is not considered a permanent dwelling during this time. So if you're renting, this is very relevant, if you're renting a apartment, then you do not put up a mezuzah, or you don't need to put up a mezuzah. Certainly don't make a bracha until 30 days. Once you're there for 30 days, that's when then it's considered like it's your space. This is only outside of Israel, as opposed to if you rent an apartment in Israel, and it's not just temporary, then you would be required to put up a mezuzah right away. Similarly, if you buy a house in South Africa, then you would be required to have a mezuzah from the moment that you begin to occupy it, because it's not a rental. Then it becomes fixed right away. Okay, 22. Selling. If you move away from your house and it is to be occupied by another Jew, you should not remove the mezuzahs, but you should leave them there, and the new occupant should pay for them. But if he doesn't, there's nothing you could do about that. So actually, when I was moving out of my apartment in New York, we had really nice mezuzahs, meaning, written with a beautiful script and on a large parchment. So I actually went out and I bought kosher mezuzahs, but of a lower end, and I replaced the ones on my door with those ones so that I could take the more expensive ones with me. Because it doesn't say you have to leave the most expensive one on the door, but the point is, since the Jew is moving in after you, you should leave him with a mezuzah. You can ask him to pay, and it would be appropriate for him to pay for it, but if he doesn't, then you cannot take them with you. Okay, 23. So this brings us to the...
Sorry, Rabbi, can I ask you a question? If I sell my house to you and there's a mezuzah, when you move in, you have to check the mezuzah to make sure that it's kosher.
So we'll discuss checking in just a few moments. So hold on to that.
Okay. Okay.
That's a good question.
Yosef, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You said when you move into a home that you buy, as soon as you move in, you should put up your mezuzahs, right?
Yeah, when you take occupancy, when you start using it.
Is it when you're occupying the property or when it becomes yours in terms of legality? In other words, once it's transferred to you, is there a difference?
So it would depend if you're occupying before or after transfer. Usually, I don't know what's usual, but from what I hear, usually people occupy after transfer. So
It
then
can happen that the transfer is delayed and you moved into the house. Are you required to do that straight away on the same basis?
So that's a great question. I may stand to be corrected, but based on the rationale that we've mentioned, so if you would move in before transfer took place, then what that means is you're really renting it right now. So
correct.
So probably you would not be required to put up a mezuzah for 30 days. After 30 days, in other words, you're only required to put it up after 30 days. That's in that order. But if it's in the reverse order, meaning it was first yours and then you moved in, then you wouldn't have to put it up as soon as it becomes yours. You would only need to put it up once it's being used, which is relevant for renovations and things like that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, so I mean, with my space, I started using the office before the rest of the house. We did a bit of renovations, so I put up mezuzahs on the cottage by the learning center because that was the space that I was using as opposed to the house that had to wait until the renovations were done so that it would be occupiable and I would start moving in. Okay, so this pretty much brings us to the conclusion of the chapter. These final few points wrap it up. So he concludes by saying one must be very diligent to observe the mitzvah of mezuzah because it is an obligation at all times. So it's quite a unique mitzvah because as long as there's a mezuzah on your door, even if you're out of the house, you're still doing the mitzvah. Meaning, once you've occupied the house, you're doing the mitzvah even if you're on vacation in Hawaii, because right now it's a house that you generally occupy, which means that the mitzvah is protecting you. The mezuzah isn't only protecting you while you're home, but it's even protecting you when you're out of the home. So wherever you enter or leave your home, you will encounter the oneness of Hashem, the name of the Holy One, blessed be He, and recalling His love, you will awaken from your lethargy, meaning your laziness, and cease going astray after the vanities of the time, meaning it's a constant spiritual reminder. So it's not just protecting us physically, it's a spiritual protection. If every time we walk in and out of the house, we kiss the mezuzah, then it keeps us on track. You will then realize that nothing endures forever except the knowledge of the Eternal One, and will immediately return to your senses and walk in the path of righteousness. So it keeps us in check, keeps our head on straight. Our sages of blessed memory say, he who has tefillin on his head and on his arm, wears tzitzis on his garments, and has a mezuzah on his doorpost is sure not to sin. Why? Because he has many reminders, and these are the guardian angels who save him from sin. So this is divine protection. And the verse says, the angel of Hashem encamps around those who fear him and sets them free. Our sages of blessed memory also say, because of the sin of mezuzah, his sons and daughters may die young, whereas one who is diligent to observe the mitzvah of mezuzah will have his days lengthened. So it brings to long life. This is certainly not a reason when people experience tragedy. It's never our space to try to explain why something happened. That's something that only God knows. But what he is saying is that it gives us longevity. It's a spiritual, it's a good spiritual protection for physical life. So it's what mezuzah is unique, as in the last mitzvahs that we discussed, and that they bring a person to long life. As it says in the verse, in order that your days be lengthened than the days of your children. This is part of the section of the Shema that we say every day. right after speaking about the mezuzah, in the second paragraph of the Shema, we speak about your days being lengthened. So from here, our rabbis understand that through keeping the mitzvah of mezuzah, it brings us longevity. And since the mezuzah serves as a reminder of the wonders of Hashem's name, therefore, when leaving the house and when entering, you should kiss the mezuzah. But you should not place your hand directly on the mezuzah itself. It is therefore important to have a glass encasement cover the name of Hashem when leaving the house and placing your hand on the mezuzah. You should say, so that was that point. Meaning, don't keep touching it. I didn't get a chance to look up the reason. I think it's just so that it doesn't actually get worn out, or maybe also because your hands may not be clean. They may have touched dirty places. So he's saying that the mezuzah should have a case. Meaning, if you were to literally affix the scroll with two brackets on the top and bottom, and you'd have the bare scroll on your doorposts, so then you wouldn't touch it. However, if you have a case, then that's fine. And finally, he says that when leaving the house and placing your hand on the mezuzah, you should say, Hashem is my keeper, Hashem is my protector by my right hand. Hashem will preserve my going out and my coming in from now until eternity. I have not seen this practice today. So while this is part of the Shulchan Aruch, it means that perhaps some have the custom to do this, but it isn't the custom in our communities. And finally, to John's question, the mezuzah of an individual should be examined 2 times every 7 years, and one belonging to a group, in order to avoid excessive bother, should be examined 2 times every 50 years. So unless you have reason to be concerned that something wrong, that the mezuzah is getting ruined, it only needs to be checked twice in 7 years. I think that same principle would apply unless there's room for suspicion. So before I answer your question, John, if you see that your mezuzah is cracking, if your mezuzah is in direct sunlight, it should have a non-transparent case. If it's not in a non-transparent case, then the sun can easily damage it. Similarly, if it's exposed to the weather. So as long as there's any reason to believe that it's being harmed, then you should check it right away. But if you have no reason to believe that there's anything wrong with it, then you're only required to check it twice in 7 years. And if it's, as like I mentioned, the Torah Academy campus that has this whole lineup of archways where there's maybe a dozen mezuzahs within a very small vicinity. I mean, if you think of the amount of mezuzahs on the campus is for sure in the hundreds. It's literally hundreds and hundreds of mezuzahs. So to check that is a very expensive task. In fact, I recently saw that a plaque was put up on the school to thank somebody for sponsoring the checking of the mezuzahs. It's a big expense. That was his sponsorship to the school. So since it's such a big expense, twice in 50 years would suffice, provided that there's no reason of concern that something went wrong. So on that note, if you're buying the house from somebody and you trust that that person got the mezuzah from a good source, which is a very important point, I'll discuss that more in a moment, then you wouldn't need to check it because it would still continue to follow its presumption. If I may stand to be corrected, but that's what I understand. I'll tell you a little story. It's a negative story, so we'll have to end up with a positive one after that. I was learning in London, in the Hampstead Garden suburbs, in the yeshiva over there for a year. And every Friday we would go to different neighborhoods, to business districts, and visit the Yidlach over there and say L'chaim, put on tefillin, give a word for Shabbos. And a friend of mine had, the particular route that he went on every Friday, and the people he became close to. And one of these businessmen went to Israel, and he came back and he decided that he's buying mezuzahs for all his doorposts. And he asked my friend if he could come and put them up. So my friend didn't want to go by himself. He asked if I'll go with him. So we went. And we arrived at the door, and the whole family was gathered around. They're very excited. They're putting up mezuzahs on their doorways. And they put the mezuzahs down in front of us. These are the cases that they bought, and here are all the scrolls. And while we're talking, I just start like kind of fiddling and I start looking at the scrolls. And one after the other, even with an ignorant eye, I was able to notice that these mezuzahs were not kosher. And I didn't know what I was going to say to them. Like, I felt so bad. The whole family's gathered around. They're all excited. They're about to do the mitzvah. And there's just that casual talk. And what's going to be now? In fact, I felt bad to rely on myself. So I called up my father in South Africa and I just double checked with him. I said, Tati, if two of the letters are touching and there's no space between them, what's the story? And he said, or maybe I messaged him, I'm not sure. He said, no, then it's not kosher. Meaning that the scribe that wrote them obviously was not scrupulous. He wasn't God-fearing. He wanted to get as much money out as he could. And so it was handwritten and it wasn't parchment. It wasn't printed, which you could also find. But he was just rattling them off, and they simply weren't kosher. And so all of them, with the naked eye, I could detect were not kosher, except for one. And I said, there's no way I'm putting up that final one without it first going to a scribe to check. They were mortified, and they're like, maybe we could just put it up in between. I said, there's no way. There's no mitzvah. It was very sad. In fact, the scrolls actually had a plastic sealing them with a stamp of rabbinic approval. That was a proper forgery. And then I Googled it afterwards and it came up right away that it's a company that's fraud. I guess somehow they hadn't been shut down in Israel yet, but meanwhile they were selling mezuzahs in the dozens. So from this story, you see it's very important to make sure that you get your mezuzahs from a source that you trust. You'll have to ask somebody that knows somebody that it's a reputable source. On a positive note, because we've got to end off on a positive note, so I'll end off where I started because I see we've run out of time. I mentioned the story of Onkelos. It was in our first class, and I'll just touch on it again. Onkelos was the nephew of a Roman emperor, and his uncle sent his soldiers to summon him to the king. And the soldiers, when they came to Onkelos, were so intrigued by Onkelos's religion that they decided to convert to Judaism. And so his uncle sent more soldiers and more soldiers. This kept happening till they told him, don't engage in any conversation with him whatsoever. And they didn't. And as he was walking out the house, being taken to the king, he kissed the mezuzah. They said, what are you doing? And he explained it to them, and they were sold. They never went back to the king. So the mezuzah is powerful. It's a really beautiful mitzvah that protects us both physically and spiritually. Wishing you a wonderful week.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thanks,
Cheers,
Rabbi.
everybody.
Cheers, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.